The American prison system has been weaponized as a form of social control. We currently have more than 2.3 million prisoners locked away, with 67% being people of color. These incarcerated individuals are the forgotten many who often lack a voice in the current era of social reform. They have faced injustice after injustice, and yet the world seems to turn a blind eye to their pleas. This is the world of trans incarceration. Given that mass incarceration affects more than half of the U.S. population, we wanted to see how much people actually knew about trans incarceration. So we took to the streets of Rutgers and asked people, what do you think trans incarceration is?
I'm not really sure.
The first thing that comes to my mind is transgender incarceration. I have no idea if that's correct, but that's my social work brain. So transgender incarceration.
Yeah, I have no idea.
I don't know.
I have no idea.
So what exactly is trans incarceration, and why is it so important?
Trans incarceration, much like critical trans politics, discusses the issues surrounding women, people of color, people of the LGBTQIA+ community, and other minorities within mass incarceration.
Now that we know what trans incarceration is, how is it different from mass incarceration?
Michelle Alexander notes in her book, The New Jim Crow, that the term mass incarceration refers to the criminal justice system and also the larger web of laws, rules, policies, and customs that control those labeled criminals both in and out of prison.
So, what other forms of mass incarceration are included in trans incarceration, rather than simply prisons?
In addition to unethical incarceration, one of the largest problems that minorities face is crimmigration.
Allison S. Hardy defines crimmigration as the alignment between immigration enforcement and the goals and methods of the criminal justice system. In her commentary, Gendering Crimmigration, the intersection of gender, immigration, and the criminal justice system.
Crimmigration includes the loss of parental rights, deportation, and many other aspects that interlace criminal justice law with immigration law that are not necessarily simply being placed in jail.
So why is it important we talk about trans incarceration, and what does it have to do with feminism?
Trans incarceration is directly related to the feminist idea of intersectionality. Intersectionality is defined by Merriam-Webster as the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experience of marginalized individuals or groups.
The theory of intersectionality allows us to understand trans incarceration and how the prison system has been designed to be a form of power domination over minorities in the United States.
By looking at some statistics, we can see how minorities are treated unfairly because of mass incarceration.
The 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey, a study of nearly 28,000 transgender adults, showed patterns of frequent harassment, profiling, and abuse by law enforcement officers, as well as high rates of incarceration.
According to federal data, transgender people are nearly 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than the general prison population.
According to a 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey, 7% of trans people are afraid to go to the police when they need it.
One of the most notable examples of our criminal justice system's cruelty is the case of Cece McDonald.
Cece was a 29-year-old trans woman of color who sparked a revolution and struggled to understand herself and faced major gender policing within her home.
Gender policing is when someone is forced to conform to the gender normality of society. And after forcing this policing, Cece felt unhappy and left home at the young age of 14. At such a young age, she was unable to provide for herself and became homeless.
On June 5th, 2011, Cece McDonald and her friends were walking down the street when mixed-gendered white people began to harass them.
They faced racist, sexist, and homophobic terms, hatred that Cece nor her friends were accustomed to hearing. After a scuffle, the attacker was killed.
When the cops arrived, Cece was immediately put into handcuffs, despite being bleeding from where she was hit in the head by a beer bottle. This is where the problems with the criminal justice system begin. Despite her injuries, Cece was only taken to the hospital briefly. After a short visit, she was then questioned for hours on end.
During her questioning, law enforcement took advantage of her and misled her. They tried to get a confession out of her right after she experienced a traumatic event.
When Cece was transferred to prison while awaiting trial, she was immediately placed into solitary confinement in a male prison, despite the fact that she is a woman. She was kept there for about a month.
This treatment is very standard for trans people in prisons. They are told that solitary confinement is a way of protecting them. Instead, it isolates them and makes them more vulnerable to gender policing.
Soon, word of Cece's arrest spread and her friends started the Free Cece movement. Cece became an icon all around the world for Black and trans women of color and the hardships they face, and the movement was able to push the prison into releasing Cece from solitary confinement. But once she was out, she faced more difficulties.
Cece maintains that outside of solitary confinement, the other prisoners had a mutual respect toward her, but the guards and prison officials often made her life much harder.
Once out of solitary, Cece was again faced with gender policing. They did not allow her to express any outward femininity. For example, they would not permit her to wear shorts or tight-fitting clothing, but the other prisoners could. To make matters worse, they would also make inappropriate sexual comments.
These clothing rules reflect the gender policing that begins as soon as one enters the jail. Nobody is allowed to look or act differently from the norm, and if they do, they're isolated until they're ready to conform.
Once they join the rest of the population, they are forced to become a number, and if they do not, they are degraded and hypersexualized until they finally submit.
In the documentary Free Cece by Laverne Cox, Cece explains that she now lives in even more fear as the experience has caused her to suffer from PTSD, in which she relives the incident in her time in prison and suffers great anxiety from it. On May 2, 2012, Cece accepted a plea deal for second-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 41 months in prison. Her sentence ended on January 13, 2014. After prison, Cece attended rehab and now identifies as a prison abolitionist.
The case of Cece McDonald is not an isolated incident. Our carceral state is problematic on multiple fronts, and there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of trans people that have fell victim to the oppression of our justice system. America has a long-rooted history with prejudice. From our founding fathers to our current president, we have always mistreated minorities in some aspect of government. The problem is rampant, and it's looking at us right in the eye. So what do we do with this information? How do we move forward as a society knowing that our prisons and law enforcement are geared towards belittling minorities? The answer lies within ourselves. We must reevaluate the ideals that have been indoctrinated into the cultural norm. We need to reconsider the validity of prisons. We need to reconsider if our police forces do more good than harm. We need to reconsider the discretion we give to our law enforcement. And ultimately, we need to reconsider our society as a whole. And once we start to change our minds, once we start to do away with this century-old system of punishment, only then will we start to see the change that we so desperately need.